Thank you so much for that generous invitation. Before I begin, I want to do an access check. How is the microphone, both in person and for our online participants? So if you're hearing, you can gesture in some way. As you came in, if you wanted a script, there were both 12-point font and 18-point font scripts. So if you rethink that somewhere through and still want one, I think there are probably some more out there. We're also making a script available for our online participants. Thank you, Patsy.
You're welcome.
I'm going to offer a brief image description of myself. I am a middle-aged white woman, about 5'10". I am wearing a brown dress with a white Swedish coat that is the length of that dress. My pronouns are she, her, and I do not identify as disabled. Throughout the lecture, I am going to be offering some image descriptions as we go along. So you'll notice as we go through that when I have images on the screen that I will briefly describe them for people who want or need them. As President Palmerville said, this is a lecture where you should take care of your body minds. If you want to stand for this entire lecture, you should do that. If you want to sit, if you want to move about the space, if you want to sit on the floor, find ways to participate in this lecture in ways that make sense for you. I'll also be offering some brief moments of interaction and reflection for those of you in person and online. And during those times, if you want to take a break and move out and come back in, I invite you to do that. There are closed captions available online. So if you're joining us online, you might look for the CC closed share caption button at the bottom of your screen. You may need to push the button, the three dots at the end of your screen to find the closed caption button to turn it on, but it should be available to you. And I think those are all the access notes that I want to begin with. So thank you for inviting me to participate in this year's Caldwell Lecture. I am deeply honored by the invitation and grateful to the family of former Louisville Seminary President Frank H. Caldwell, who honor his memory and legacy through these lectures. I am also grateful to President Andrew Palmerville, Dean Deborah Mumford, Cassandra Turpin, Dr. Marcus Hong, Karen Crane, Jean Newman, Norm Hollabaugh, Aria Turpin, Rebecca Diamond, and the Office of Philanthropy and Stewardship for the reception that they are hosting afterwards. I'm also grateful to others of you whose names I may not know for the ways you are welcoming me and supporting my participation in this lecture. Access to events like this one require the work of so many people who make hotel reservations, who set up chairs, who run the webinar, who make flyers, who take registrations. And so I'm grateful for each person whose work with technologies makes my words and ideas come to life today. I also want to express my gratitude to those of you who are part of the disability community for all the ways you have taught and continue to teach me about access as a practice of anti-ableism and of love. And last but not least, I want to thank each of you who's taken time to be here late on a Thursday afternoon and a beautiful day. Thank you for taking time to be with us. I'm profoundly honored to be in dialogue with all of you about a matter of justice that is vital for the church, present and future of the Christian church.
There you go.
So on this slide, a small silver robot with red hands and feet raises their left hand as if gesturing or waving. So I want to begin this lecture with an act of worship, that is a confession. When I first received this generous invitation to give the Caldwell Lecture on the topic of accessible worship in an age of technology, I laughed out loud. And I laughed because I often lament to my spouse that machines don't like me the way that they like him. Many technologies are not intuitive to me in the ways that they are to some of my peers. From computer software to mechanized door locks, I'm often mystified by tools that are designed to make my life easier. I sometimes attribute this to the earliest years of my life growing up in a very rural part of the southern African country of Zambia. And while cell phones are very common in Zambia now, in the late 70s and early 80s, even landline telephones were not common in the very rural area where we lived. And so children, like me, were the messengers that were sent to other people's homes to communicate invitations, information, and requests. We were a human technology of access. And perhaps for this reason, face-to-face or in-person communication often still feels easiest to me. But as technology of access, there we go. But as Associate Dean for Worship Life at Columbia Seminary, as one who supports 2 worship services at Columbia every week, I have been stretched to imagine worship in ways that query my own habits and preferences. Worship through slides, live stream, through video recordings, through YouTube, and on Zoom. In my work with our chapel worship, I often feel as if I am learning to speak a new language, one in which I am continuously discovering new parts of speech, as well as discerning different accents, rhythms, and aesthetics. I am grateful for teachers and translators who help me communicate through practices I would not have imagined when I was a child, and who expand my theological imagination about what it means to be a creature who communicates with God and with others in this world. But before I investigate the ways that some technologies used in Christian worship might impact practices of access, I want to reflect with you on what worship is and why access matters in the first place. So on this slide, I am facing a student in our chapel space and marking her forehead with glitter as part of a student-led chapel service. As I think about expanding forms of access, I am challenged to consider how moments like this one, involving touch, are extended to those participating online, as well as how we might think about practices of consensual touch as part of our considerations of access. So what is Christian worship? Why do Christians worship God together, with an emphasis on the word together? That is, why do those of us who worship need other people to gather together in order to worship God? So I'm going to invite each of you to reflect on this question for a minute. You could type an answer, write an answer, draw a picture of an answer, or if you prefer to turn to someone near you and you have someone near you, you could turn to them and share an answer at this time. And this is an invitation to both our in-person and online participants. So take a minute to answer this question. Why do we worship God together? I'm going to give you a few minutes.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I haven't sat in here that.
So I'd love to hear a few answers or ideas, not even answers, a few ideas you came up with. And this includes, again, from our in-person, and then we can voice aloud from our online audience or our online gathering. You can type in the chat or raise your hand, and Cassie will unmute you and you can speak. And we're looking for brief answers. I know we could talk about this all day. Someone there and then here.
We were saying that we feel like.
They'll bring a mic to you so we can hear you, and also involve our online audience.
Thank you. We were saying that we experience God together, like through our interactions with each other, by taking care of one another. That's how you experience God.
Yeah. So, experiencing God through togetherness, through being together.
I was also thinking about the confession and passing of the peace, that, you know, we're being reconciled to God and to some extent to ourselves, but we're also being reconciled to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is that moment when we act that out with each other.
Yeah. So action and transformation that happens with God and with each other.
I was raised an only child, and it was my mother and father's desire that they didn't put me in a nursery. I went to worship, and my father used to give me candy to quiet me down, but then I got captivated with what was happening with the community. And I noticed that everyone that crossed that threshold had a connection spiritually. And then I learned verbally the faith through the man at that time, 1955, in the black robe, that started to formulate my spiritual center. But that happened in communitas, in the community of faith.
You describe a formation happening across time in community. Yeah.
Yes, so I was saying that in the beginning, whenever God created Adam, God said it's not good for man to be alone. So if it's not good for man to just be alone, then I guess there's a greater aspect whenever we worship together.
Yeah, thinking about God's desire for people to be together. Yeah. Or do we have anyone online who wants to share?
Don't see any raised hands.
We don't see anyone from our online. So we can maybe take one more, and then I'm going to move on if anyone here wants to speak.
Because of the biblical directive to fail not to assemble yourselves together.
Right, we in the Bible, we hear a call, a command to gather together. So we have to get our cursors coordinated for this to work.
1 second, there we go.
Okay. So I want to begin our reflection on access and technology with an affirmation of faith, something that I believe. I believe that Christian worship requires the beauty and tension of human creatures gathered before God and called together in relationship through God to one another. Liturgical theologian Gordon Lathrop argues that, quote, assembly, a gathering together of participating persons, constitutes the most basic symbol of Christian worship. So he emphasizes that all other symbols require this assembly of people in the first place. It's a pretty radical claim if you think about it. So in this slide, alongside my affirmation of faith, there is a photo of a group of people sitting in a circle. Their faces are not visible, but we do see 3 pairs of hands, and all of them seem to be gesturing to one another. So Lathrop goes on to write, from the initial remembrance of the baptism that joined us to this assembly, to the common singing of the assembly, to the opening greeting that intends to surround us all verbally with the life of the triune God, to the book opened as our communal book, to the meal as our communal meal, to the common dismissal. All will be a shared action. So at the heart of these social obligations of Christian worship is a liturgical anthropology. And what do I mean by that long phrase? I mean an understanding of the human person that emphasizes that communal knowledge and individual participation are both necessary for the worship of God. So I now want to unfold 3 key ideas within this liturgical theology that ground my reflections on access and worship technologies today. So first, I believe that in worship, God chooses to reveal God's self to the gathered community again and again and again. Through the power of the Spirit, God chooses to make God's self accessible to those gathered through some of the most basic activities of human life, through singing and storytelling, through water and bread. The liturgical theologian Chauvet describes sacraments as the Word of God at the mercy of the body. And I find this a powerful way of considering all worship, God communicating God's self to us through means that are accessible to our body minds. God wants to make sense to us in a way that we can understand. But second, there's a catch. Because worship is a shared practice, because it is the work and art of a communal body, for God to communicate with us in worship, the gathered must also make sense to each other. In other words, worship is a continuous practice of performing and creating access to one another. Many of us who worship take this for granted, and much like we might take for granted the magic and skill of speaking a language and having another person understand what we are saying. Consider an ecumenical chapel space like the one I worship in at Columbia Seminary, where people from many different ecclesial and cultural backgrounds gather. Gestures, postures, and practices of prayer and preaching that create access to common worship for some are experienced as barriers to others. For example, for some in our community, using the technology of a book to sing creates the possibility of connecting to God through harmonies that unite voices. Others find the use of books with printed words and music they cannot read alienating and insist on screens as a much more familiar practice of devotion. Still, others are formed in oral practices of song leading, where the human voice is the primary instrument, and sounds and words are taught rather than read. A worship space marked by expansive formation and diverse community means that we are continually experiencing moments where practices that are accessible and meaningful to some members create confusion and barriers to others. Worshiping together, we cannot take access for granted and must continually co-create shared practices for common worship. So that's number 2. Third, this making sense to one another through worship is complicated because I believe God calls us to bring both the parts of ourselves we have in common with others, but also our creaturely differences. So for God to reveal God's self in worship, for humans to know ourselves as God sees and knows us in worship, worshipers must bring all of what it means to be human. My mentor, Don Saliers, calls this worship as, quote, humanity at full stretch. And we might say creatureliness at full stretch. Saliers uses this concept to emphasize worshipers bringing the fullness of their lives over time. In my own work, I extend Saliers' metaphor to help worshiping communities consider not only differences over time and in different seasons of life, but also all of the embodied differences that each human brings to a worship space, and all the varied ways that body minds engage one another. So if I take seriously these 3 ideas, that God reveals or makes God's self accessible to us each time we worship, that access to God requires those who gather to communicate and make sense to one another, and that bringing the fullness of ourselves to God and one another gathers not only similarities, but also differences, then access is not something worshipers practice if we have the time or luxury or resources or technologies, but something that is integral to every service of Christian worship. Co-creating access together is an act of worshiping God as we collaborate to make it possible for each of us to offer our humanity to God and one another. We are already worshiping. So now technology. What might technology have to do with access? In this slide, there is a graphic of a single black microphone on a red background and also an outline in white of a computer on a black background. So now that I've made a case for considering access as essential for each community and each person who worships God in that community, what does technology have to do with that access? What do I mean by technology anyway? And how might we who are gathered here consider the role of technology in our current era? So the Encyclopedia Britannica defines technology as the application of scientific knowledge to the practical aims of human life, or as it is sometimes phrased, to the change and manipulation of the human environment. The Merriam-Webster's dictionary offers a fourfold definition of technology. The practical application of knowledge, especially in a particular area. A capability given by the practical application of knowledge. A manner of accomplishing a task, especially using technical processes, methods, or knowledge. And the specialized aspects of a particular field of endeavor. I don't know what jumps out at you when you look at these definitions, but when I look at these definitions of technology, they raise questions for me about whose knowledge is applied to the space and time of worship, and to what end. In other words, who is impacted by the changes in our environments that come from using specialized knowledge? And what transformation of environments should worshipers seek through their use of technology? So in an article titled Christian Worship and the Question of Technology, liturgical theologian Gerald Liu reflects on the writings of philosopher Martin Heidegger to consider the problems and possibilities of modern technology and worship. Drawing on Heidegger, Liu considers the work of a pre-modern technology, the jug. Summarizing Heidegger, Liu describes the jug's function in both everyday and religious terms. A jug is a type of equipment, a kind of technological advance, a vessel in which liquid can be stored, held, and poured. Yet, the jug is also much more. It consecrates, it gives. The jug unconceals visible and invisible realities. So in this slide, a series of clay pots are lined up next to one another, filling the screen. These pots remind me of vessels used by many people in Zambia to haul water and store food. This slide contains the outline of a black and white pitcher. The pitcher is partially full of some liquid. The pitcher reminds me of pitchers we use to pour water into our baptismal font in chapel and to pour wine or juice into a chalice before communion. And in this slide, someone pours water from a pitcher into a clay vessel that is on the ground. We can see their hands and a white tunic, but their face is hidden from us. So Liu with Heidegger identifies a possible concern with modern technologies. They do not, quote, bring forth or make present hidden truths about the world and the sacred. Instead, modern technology hides those truths through calculation and commodification. Now, we may disagree with this analysis, but in this analysis, Liu reminds us that the question of technology is a question of social relationships with God and with others. What kinds of tools or instruments and what qualities of engagement with the material world cause us to attend to God's revelation and to God's presence among us? Do our technologies remind us, those of us who use them, of the ways the divine comes to us again and again in worship? Do they make God known to us? So to consider this question, many of us might turn to the role of modern digital technologies, and I'll get there. But I find it helpful to first consider a technology that is even more common in worship spaces, the chair or the pew. While chairs or benches may feel as common as Bibles in churches these days, even more common than Bibles, humans have only been sitting on chairs for a short time of our existence as a species. And at one point in time, chairs were considered only for the wealthy. Even today, different cultures and contexts use chairs differently. Some of the worshiping communities I knew in Zambia didn't use chairs or benches, or only had some for some people. Others sat on the ground and stood or sat on stools. When I lived in the country of Ukraine, chairs were not used in many Orthodox liturgies, affecting and emerging from practices of participation as people came and went from the liturgy rather than starting at the beginning and going through to the end. So in this slide, 4 plastic chairs with wooden legs are lined up, one next to each other against a gray wall. 3 are white and 1 is yellow, but they are all the same size and shape. And in this slide, rows of white plastic bucket chairs are lined up in a white brick church with multiple arches. The chairs face an elevated altar from which a beam of light appears to be rising. So in most North American Protestant communities, many take seating for granted as a technology that makes worship possible, and yet often also explicitly or implicitly expect most people to stand from time to time for full participation in worship. Many congregations also expect worshipers to sit for most of the time, rather than standing or moving about the space. The kinds of chairs or pews used in worship may also affect the worship of children or wheelchair users, or people who identify as short or tall or fat or experience chronic pain. Such expectations around sitting or standing raise important questions about how the use of chairs or pews in worship benefit or create barriers to the full range of human differences that are present in our worship spaces. So I use this example of a chair to make this point. In every worshiping community, technologies are used and have always been used to support the body of those in worship. And those technologies provide for certain bodies, making worship possible for some of us and creating barriers for others. Any technology we use, including chairs or jugs or computers, invites us to query the ways that their use reveals or conceals God's presence in our midst. The question is not, shall worshipers use technology? The question is, whose bodies are given access to worship and through what technologies? Whose access is prioritized and for what reasons? In this sense, Christian worship is a space where we who worship together imagine the common good of those of us who gather and in which we allocate resources. How might worshiping communities allocate technologies to expand access so that those of us who have experienced barriers to worship can bring the fullness of their humanity, our humanity and bodies to the prayer and praise of God? So my perception around this question of whose bodies are prioritized in worship has been shaped by a field called disability studies and disability theologies, and by their assessment of ableism. And if you're someone who's already familiar with these fields, especially someone from the disability community, you might take this as an opportunity to take a short break from the lecture and rest your body mind. But for those of you who are new to these fields, I want to briefly summarize some important premises of these fields. So rather than defining or understanding disability as a problem within an individual body-mind to be solved, healed, or cured, disability theologians emphasize disability as a social cultural phenomenon. Disability studies is an academic discipline that emerges from the wisdom of some in the disability community and asks questions about how we understand what it means to be normal, and also questions how our societies enforce expectations for normalcy. Disability studies privileges and prioritizes human difference over human sameness or similarities. It thus challenges the idea that there even is a normal human person. It also challenges the way we conceive of what disability studies scholar Robert McRory calls compulsory able-bodiedness. That is our expectations about what bodies and persons should be able to do in order to be counted as full human persons. Every person moves through and navigates the world differently, but the social, cultural, and political worlds we live in are designed to support and sustain some bodies more than others. So disability studies focuses attention on the knowledge, wisdom, and experience of disabled people and disability communities regarding their own lived experiences. Emerging from these lived experiences, the disability community claims disability as an ordinary part of embodied human life, rather than a tragedy to be overcome or a source of inspiration for others. And finally, disability scholars argue that disability isn't a special condition that affects just a few people, but that ways that people and communities conceive of and structure disability and ability affects all of us. It's not something that we can choose to ignore. So in this slide, 3 figures appear on a background filled with colorful geometric shape. One figure sits on a pile of books and draws. The other 2 face each other, gesturing as if they are conversing with one another or communicating in some way. They all seem to be connected by a black line or cord that curlicues around the image and is connected to a light bulb. This image reminds me of a group brainstorming process that is interconnected but not linear. So in our definitions of technology, I noted technology as the use of specialized knowledge to change environments. And here I want to draw on some of the particular wisdom that comes from lived experiences of some Christians in the disability community, likely including some of you attending this lecture, in order to guide consideration of technology and practices of access and worship more broadly. For I believe that attending to the creative ways that those of us who have experienced barriers to access helps all worshipers imagine Christian liturgy in more expansive ways. So over the past few years, I have facilitated a collaborative project with disabled and non-disabled Christians to create disability-centering prayers and other liturgical resources. These liturgical resources emerge in significant part from 25 interviews our team conducted with Christians who identified as disabled about their experiences of worship. A good number of those we interviewed celebrated the access they had experienced through live stream and online recordings during the COVID-19 pandemic. But they also worried that when a majority of non-disabled congregants no longer needed this kind of online access, congregations would stop prioritizing it or consider it not worth the investment of time and money. But of course, like other technologies used in worship, experiences of these online technologies differ from person to person. So in this slide and in the next slide, a person sits at a desk smiling into a desktop computer in which 9 other faces are visible. On the table below the computer is a keyboard, a mouse, and a candle in the far corner of the photo. Here I'm going to use a set of paired prayers for Church on Zoom, written by Reverend Becca Marin Anderson, a queer and disabled writer and theologian, and one of the collaborators on the Disability Liturgy Project, which I've been referencing. I'd encourage you to check out her writing at beccamarin.blogspot.com. And I've asked a couple of readers today to help us engage in these prayers. So the first person is going to read Thanksgiving for Church on Zoom with a microphone.
We're praying, so please join me in the spirit of prayer in whatever posture you feel comfortable. God, whose love and worship know no bounds, we thank you for this form of worship, unbounded by physical space. Through the wonders of this worship space, we are connected in prayer and praise to people many miles away, known and unknown to us. We are able to worship from the comfort and accessibility of chair or bed, alone or with family. On mute, we may sing as loudly or as softly as we like, without fear of judgment. We may stem and vocalize and flap our arms, and no one objects.
Live transcription helps create access when we cannot hear. Our communion bread is toast or crackers or cookies or whatever is holy through being tasty. Our cup of blessing is coffee or tea or soda or juice or whatever quenches our thirst for the divine. We find freedom, connection, and your presence here, O God. May we praise you always in this virtual space and everywhere. Amen.
And the second paired prayer is a lament for church on Zoom.
Intimate God, we feel distant, alone. The screen is cold and lifeless before us. The faces of our friends and family remind us only that they are not here. The sight of our community worshiping in person reminds us that we are not with them. We sing on mute, and few, if any, voices join us. We reach out, but no hands can hold ours. Connection problems and bad mics interrupt what moments of prayer we can find. The automatic captions are unhelpful. ASL is absent, and no one offers visual descriptions. Our bread and our cup are blessed from afar, and the body of Christ feels scattered, divided. Hear our lament, O God. Comfort us in our disconnection and isolation. Remind us that you know how it feels to be lonely in the company of others. Help us remember that you are present with us, that the barriers that keep us from our community cannot hinder you. May we grieve all we need to grieve, knowing that we are held in your love. Amen.
Are there any words and phrases that jump out to you that resonate with your experience or that are different from your experience of church on Zoom? An experience that many of us have had? Anyone wants to offer one?
The problems part, like when it works and when it doesn't. The problems part, when it works and when it doesn't work. We streamed this last Sunday from church and it got cut off halfway through, right before our All Saints celebration.
Okay. Yeah. Anyone online? Anyone else?
In 2020, as we were learning to pivot, the first time that we celebrated communion, the sanctuary was empty. And all the other speaking parts had already done their part. And then the worship was going to be, pieced together by someone who knew how to do that. And I was celebrating communion alone in the sanctuary with a videographer and then someone also to do the sound. And when it was finished, and I had finished my part, I said to the two people in the sanctuary, one all the way up in the sound booth and the other one behind, an over-the-shoulder camera, Jonathan, that I recognized from my time in broadcasting. And I said, y'all have to come. You have to come to the table. I can't do this alone. So that was that initial experience on the first Sunday of April, 2020. We got used to it, but it was really hard.
Yeah. The others online before I move on? So thank you for sharing those testimonies, and actually you're leading really well into one of my next points. But before that, I'm going to ask these questions. How might those of us who seek to use technologies in faithful ways support diverse experiences of those same technologies, as well as collective commitment to access? How might worshiping communities pay attention to the multiple divergent ways that the same kinds of technology reveal and conceal the presence of God in, among, and through us? While there are no simple answers to these questions, I want to offer you 5 practices that I find helpful in my own work, in the hopes that they may also support you in your discernment in the particular cultures and contexts in which you are navigating these questions with different sets of resources and different access needs in each of your communities. So practice 1. First, I seek out narratives and testimonies, much like we just heard here, about lived experiences of worship. And in doing so, I try to pay particular attention to those who have experienced barriers to participation in worship. I believe that many of us who plan and lead worship can cultivate more opportunities for those who gather to share their experiences in order to discern faithful use of technologies. Some of those we interviewed called this developing a culture of feedback. By paying attention to the testimonies, even the ones that make some of us uncomfortable, we may identify not an either or, but a yes and. That is a range of technologies that are needed to meet the access needs of our communities. For example, while some who experience a range of obstacles to getting to a physical building may want or need regular access through live stream or recorded worship services, others may want or need to gather in person, but also need transportation. I'm on the board of a congregation that uses vans or buses to support congregants whose participation in worship is supported through transportation from their group homes. Their vans and their drivers are one of the most valuable technologies they have. These vans make this important point as well. Reflecting on technologies of worship requires thinking about worship, not simply as what happens between the call to worship and the benediction, but as the gathering and sending of a community over time. It means also thinking about the political spaces, the politics of the spaces from which people come, and the inequities that mean that some people have transportation and some people do not. So in my experience, expanding forms of access often means conversations about how to allocate resources and which accessible formats for worship to prioritize first. In this case, one place to begin is to have conversations with those who have most frequently experienced lack of access to worshiping communities and those who have been minoritized in our communities. These conversations can help to guide institutional priorities and allocations. Rather than start with the preference of a majority, invite feedback from and consider access needs of a minority. Then invite others who are very used to having their access needs met in worship be stretched in their understanding of God as they take on new practices. In communities where financial or personnel resources are more limited, I have found that there are still always ways to prioritize access. So one of our students at Columbia helped us understand the need to have a STEM corner with fidgets during worship. But based on her experience as a pastor of a congregation that centered neurodivergent participants, she found that it wasn't enough just to have a STEM corner. It was also important for pastors and other leaders to use those spaces, to be in those spaces, so that these places also became part of the whole community, valued and considered part of its sacred movement and activity. Purchasing the fidgets, finding a table is relatively easy, but making that corner an integral part of worship space is more challenging, but equally important. So these forms of access, like all forms of access, still require transformed engagement by a whole community. So this connects with a second practice. In my own context, I try to imagine, invite, and support multiple ways of joining and leading in any collective act of worship. So in the interviews our research team did with disabled Christians, one of the themes we heard was this: there are many different ways to pray. But it's not enough to assume that everyone will take up the implied option of participating in a way that makes sense for their body-mind. Rather, it's important that worship leaders make options explicit. For example, before communion in our seminary chapel, leaders offer a long list of instructions about different ways to participate in this sacred meal. This list anticipates a small number of a myriad ways this ecumenical seminary community might participate in communion. Those who need or want to come forward, those who need or want to sit, those who can take from the common cup, those who require individual cups, those who are vegan, those who are gluten-free, those who may only want a blessing, those online who must gather their own elements, and those online who may only want a blessing. This multiplicity of invitations emerges from the lived experiences of worshipers in our context and attempts to carve out more space and time for all of us to participate in a common table. And still, there are some of us who experience barriers. As a liturgical act, the project of co-creating access is never finished. And I apologize, this paragraph isn't in your script, so if you're reading along, this one paragraph isn't there. In his reflections on universal design for learning in the book Academic Ableism, Professor of English J. Timothy Dalmage emphasizes this three-part approach to design. And he's thinking about classrooms. We might think about it in terms of worship spaces. He said there should be multiple means of representation. So we might think, in what ways is the word of God proclaimed? Are there multiple means? There are multiple means of expression. You might think about, are there multiple ways that people are responding to and participating in their witness to the word? And then multiple means of engagement. And here he's thinking about interest, growth, and formation. When I think about this, I think, is there also access to leadership, right? Is there access not only to participation in worship, is there access to leadership? So as an aside, Dalmage's text, Academic Ableism, may be helpful for some of us thinking about questions of access, not only in the context of worship, but also in the context of seminary education. So a consideration of multiple ways that those gathered might express themselves and engage in worship also means considering the ways that technologies are integral to embodied expression and engagement. Worshipers in the disability community who have long used digital technologies for access help others of us understand that many bodies regularly incorporate technologies as essential to their access of other people. If glasses, phones, microphones, wheelchairs, sign language interpreters, support animals, and screens are all understood as integral extensions of human bodies and relationships to, for, and with one another in God, this might lead you, into a deeper understanding of the God who is present through multiple fleshly forms, and to understand the way that the Holy Spirit works across space and time through multiple technologies that are actually part of our experience of embodiment. So third, preparation for worship is also worship. Third, I consider preparation for worship as part of worship because I believe that expanding access means expanding understandings of what corporate worship is. In my context, that means that communal worship begins not only at 10 a.m. when the whole community gathers, but also at 9:15 or 9:30 a.m. when the choir arrives to help give us access to the songs we're going to sing, when our educational technologist and his team crowd into our very small sound booth to live stream, when we do sound checks to ensure mics are working and our worship leaders are prepared to use them. In fact, worship starts even earlier when the slides are being assembled and the chairs arranged to allow for movement during communion, when a student is baking the gluten-free bread in their oven. And worship continues after chapel over lunch when our worship office students and staff reflect together on how we experience the presence of God. And where we experience barriers, we bring narratives of our experiences and our observations of others' participation. These gatherings, too, are communal worship as we give thanks to God and ask for the wisdom to continue to reveal the divine presence among us. Practice 4, access as love rather than a problem to solve. So on the slide is an image from the site Access is Love, and I'm going to offer a description that is used of this photo from that site. Photo of 3 disabled Asian American women, Mia Mingus, Alice Wong, and Sandy Ho, from left to right. Mia is wearing glasses and large hoop earrings. Alice is wearing a brightly colored scarf and an army camouflage print jacket. She is wearing a mask over her nose with a tube for her BiPAP machine. Sandy has a wavy short hair and is wearing a black sweater. Behind them is a concrete wall with a door. So third, I seek to practice accessible worship as love rather than considering some worshipers as an access problem to solve. This is a practice and a way of framing access that I learned from engaging the work of disability activists, like the three here. If disability communities emphasize intentional and ongoing discernment as a means of shared embodiment, they also describe the collective work of creating access as one of love. Such love is not sentimental nor apolitical, but relational and covenantal. Such a practice of solidarity that shifts the burden away from a few people to engage access as a liberatory communal practice. So I think of an example of a practice we often encouraged in chapel, but did most consistently and faithfully when we were all wearing masks. My office asked preachers to make available preaching manuscripts or notes if they were using them, and we made 10 to 12 copies for those present in 12-point and 18 or 22-point font. We had in mind people whose ways of seeing and hearing would benefit from a printed text. And what we found is that many others in our community benefited as well, including a good number of our students who sometimes found spoken English difficult to understand, especially through a mask. By working to create access for some of us through printed text, more of us were able to join in worship, a liberatory practice for all of us. Disability activist Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samarasina poses the question this way. What does it mean to shift our ideas of access and care, whether it's disability, childcare, economic access, or many more, from an individual chore to a collective responsibility that's maybe even deeply joyful? Describing collective access as, quote, revolutionary love without charity, she asks how communities might reconceive tasks that are often emphasized as burdens on both individuals and societies without romanticizing such struggle. How do we learn to do this? She says this. How do we learn to do this love work of collective care that lifts us instead of abandons us, grapples with all the deep ways that care is complicated? So rather than understanding practices of access as necessary but difficult and undesirable disruptions to preferred practices or begrudged forms of accommodation that distract from access to God and one another, participating in collective access can be a form of shared embodiment that is both response to and an encounter with God, a God who is in love with us and so provides access to God's self and to all creation through material objects and social relationships. So in defining collective access as a principle of disability justice, Piepsna Samarasina also emphasizes some of its prominent features, and I'm going to name some of them because I think they're helpful for us thinking about this in our community. First, refusal of shame associated with access needs. 2, creativity, flexibility, and a willingness to explore new ways of doing things. 3, recognition that access needs might be met privately or through a collective. 4, holding autonomy within community. And 5, claiming vulnerability while also respecting strength. Piepsna Samarasina and other disability activists describe the ways collective experimentations with creating access as love emerge out of shared understandings of disability communities with particular emphasis on Black, Brown, and queer CRIP communities. She also acknowledges the challenges that abled or non-disabled persons have embracing such radical understandings and practices of collective access. This slide includes a plastic clipboard with 3 items on it, 2 of which have been checked off and green, with the 3rd remaining unchecked in gray. So here I want to lift up another piece of wisdom from the interviews our research team did with disabled Christians. Many of the people we interviewed were wary of access as simply a checklist of things to do or not to do, a kind of ableist perfectionism in creating access and being anti-ableist. Now let me be clear, checklists and access audits are incredibly helpful, and I encourage use of them, and there are many good resources out there that can help you to do them. I use checklists in my worship setting to help my team with our array of gifts and abilities, create a worship space that is responsive to our seminary community. But as some of those interviewed reminded us, folks can do their due diligence to check off access lists without transforming their assumptions and desires about the body minds of the people who gather. And so this connects to my next practice, my final practice. So fifth, I have learned to understand accessible worship as a journey of transformation rather than a destination. In my introduction to Christian worship, one of the ways we talk about Christian worship is as rehearsal. That is, worship is practicing together the kingdom of God in our assemblies. It's one of the meanings of worship that many students feel is lost or hidden in worshiping communities they know. And by this, I don't mean preparing or rehearsing for a worship service, which I've argued is also a part of worship, but rather understanding that when we gather for worship, we are called to discern and perform together what God's future feels like. These kinds of rehearsals require many to bring our collective wisdom and imagination to the task of asking, what does a space and time of flourishing for all God's beloved ones feel like, look like, taste like, sound like, smell like, move like? This slide includes a black and white image of a steep set of stairs that continue up beyond the edge of the photo next to a brick wall. Here is a prayer poem by the disabled scholar and minister Reverend Allison Huntley Better, which links an imagination about heaven to practices of everyday communities, and I've asked someone else to read it.
There are no stairs in heaven. There are no stairs in heaven, no risk to trip or fall. The reign of God that's coming is accessible to all. There's ramps and elevators, there's rails on every wall. No ableist, no haters, it's accessible to all. There's Braille on every street sign, the print is never small. There's ASL in real time, it's accessible to all. There's fidgets in the chancel, free wheelchairs in the hall. Our PCAs don't cancel, it's accessible to all. There are no stairs in heaven.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Got it. 1 second.
Choreography.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. So one of the things I appreciate about this litany is that it could go on forever. Each of us adding verses about lived experiences of access and singing the verses we've learned from others. While I won't make you write in verse today, I would like you to share with some of your neighbors, or work alone if you prefer, and jot down some ideas on a device of your choosing. Based on your own experience of worship, what makes worship spaces accessible to you and your neighbors? What gets in the way of this access? How might communities of which you are a part co-create access as a taste of heaven on earth? So again, I'm going to invite this as a moment for you to either do something on your own, jot down some ideas on your own, or if you prefer to turn to someone near you and talk about it, you can do that as well. And again, the same invitation to our online participants. So if we can come back together, perhaps some of these conversations will feed our question and answer time as we're moving into that. So I just have some concluding reflections, another affirmation of faith, and then we'll move into a time of question and answer. So to conclude, we worship a God whose many names we speak, and yet whose ways of loving and creating can never be fully understood. To know and name and love this God, I believe that those of us who plan and lead worship and who worship require new and ancient ways of holding out what it means to be a creature before God and what it means to be loved by God. When ways of naming and imagining life in community summon and offer the fullness of human embodiment, culture, and the created world, then our prayers participate more fully in divine beauty. Christian worship participates in this beauty, even as it also and always is a practice of what disability theologian Nancy Eastland calls a communion of struggle, to speak truth about the powers that keep us from one another and thus from God, and to rehearse together new forms of flourishing that engage our technological worlds to better access one another. So now's the time for your questions. And also, if you experience barriers to access in this lecture, I've included my email address, and I'd love to know them so that I can incorporate them into the next lecture that I give. Yes. And we have one question from an online participant that will also.
Hi, Skip Hansen again. I had the privilege of serving the Presbyterian Church USA as a mission funding counselor for the Bicentennial Fund. In 1990, to many churches that I served, and they agreed to do the campaign on one condition, that they can do a combined concurrent campaign. What that meant is that half for the Bicentennial Fund and half for a need that they had as a congregation. And there are many Presbyterian churches that at that time added ramps and elevators, so they would become cognizant of that issue. Now, as you were talking, I was thinking, and one of the things I thought about on personal raise, Joe Harringtonian, who was a professor at McCormick, used to have a phrase. He said, God creates a good world, and lo, there's a snake in it. And we've been hearing a lot of information now about the possibility of artificial intelligence and its ramifications. And as I'm seeing technology, I'm saying, can technology with artificial intelligence hurt or help? Just a question.
I thought this might be a question. This is why I offered practices rather than answers. So I think one of the practices is, how are narratives of lived experiences of use of AI or ChatGPT or whatever? I think we need those narratives to know how this might affect our church communities. I think I would be wary to use any easy yes or no answers for any technology, the chair, the jug, the computer, and rather look for a full narrative of lived experiences by which we discern what is harming people and who is harmed, right? Like who that's one of the points, is that who benefits from it. There's a student at Columbia who is planning to do research thinking about how AI or ChatGPT might be helpful to pastors writing sermons. That's one of his interests. So I don't know if he'll pursue it further. But again, one of the questions is not, again, I think we can often say an either or, and one of the practices I'm encouraging us to think of is not either or, but let's thicken our description of what's happening when we use technologies, and then use that for communal discernment about how we move forward. That's helpful.
Question. So we have an anonymous question in the Q&A. I'm interested in the languaging. Accessibility is the key issue for those with differing abilities. How this is framed makes a significant difference. Please explain the use of the languaging disabilities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is such an important question. So when I tend to use people with disabilities or disability, and that is language I learned from contact with disability communities who take on that language as a social and political term, right? Understanding a minority identity rather than using language such as differently abled or special needs or other kinds of language that many people in the disability community find euphemistic and not really understanding a kind of social political minority identity. Again, there are different models of disability. It's more than I can go into in this lecture to cover that. So thinking about ways not to erase. We're all differently abled. Erase is a kind of experience of disability. That being said, many people with disabilities choose different language to identify themselves, and as they should, as many of us use different language to complexly talk about our multiple identities, right? We choose different ways of saying that and speaking about that. So you're right. that whoever asked this question, using the language of disability may feel offensive to some people with disabilities and people who don't have disabilities. And that would be something for a community to discern. I use it because of the location of the scholarship that I use and the kinds of communities that I'm a part of. And I would be happy to share more information about that. And there's an ongoing dialogue and debate, especially around first-person language, people with disabilities. Some people like to have the person first, emphasizing a distance from the disability as core to the identity. And then disabled people really claims the disability is integral to the identity. But of course, there are a range of ways that people speak. And I think one of the practices is to ask how people want to be named and how they want to be identified, and then to honor that practice in community life. So thank you for that really important question. And again, if you would want to follow up with my email address, I would be happy to converse with you further. Thank you for that.
Teresa Smith comments, we should be aware and understand that what is comfortable to one may literally be a barrier for others in worship. Encouraged to ask more about others' worship experiences in order to be more aware.
Yeah, I think that's key to what I've been hoping, is that we are thinking that things that give us access, give one of us access, might create barriers, but that also there are ways that we can discern through that how to work together to co-create access, so that we're not just, I do think I've learned from disability communities, the ways that multiple access needs can be met simultaneously, right? That we can work towards that. It's not just an impossibility, it's not just a competition. There is a way to kind of move forward into figuring out how to co-create that access.
We have a number of immigrants in our congregation. We have Cameroonians, we have Nigerians, and we now have some Chinese. Well, I don't speak Cameroonian and I don't speak Chinese, but one of the things that our technology people have worked out is we have installed translators on their cell phones and gave them hearing devices that they can hold their cell phone up and it will translate automatically into Chinese for them. And they are using that as a way of learning to associate Chinese words with English words. And so they're basically learning English by listening to Chinese on their phone.
Yeah, there's really, I think, powerful ways that technologies help us to work it in sort of multiple languages. And then I think one of the questions that I always think about is, how are we moving, and this is sort of embedded in this lecture, but is really a different one, and I would actually recommend a book written by Aaron Rafferty, but thinking about how are we moving beyond models of inclusion to transformation? How are the languages spoken also transforming the spaces of worship where you're worshiping, such that there isn't just individual translation for people who need it, but that the languages of those people worshiping is also transforming the worship space. So Aaron Rafferty has written a really powerful book called, oh, now I'm going to forget the title, but it's Beyond Inclusion. So thinking about moving beyond inclusion to disability justice. And she really challenges some of the ways that some of us have thought about access in terms of just including, right? Thinking about what are practices of including, rather than thinking about transformation toward disability justice. And I'd recommend it to all of us as a resource, not only for thinking about disability, but thinking about just models of inclusion that are practiced in many of our churches. Many communities that I know hold up inclusion as an ideal, and then thinking about how do we move beyond that to kind of being transformed. But I really appreciate that, bringing up language, which is, I alluded to at the beginning, but think a lot about how is a kind of multilingual, in many ways we're multilingual in multiple ways, and how do we celebrate that?
Depending on the depth of the questions, and responses, about one or two more.
This is kind of a loose association, but I think about the follow-up, because I think so oftentimes we have sermons that go forth and there are so many questions.
and there are missed opportunities to say what resonates with you.
Yeah.
So if there was a forum that people could consult where they could connect with others and ask questions, and that might be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's such a kind of, a great structure to think about in terms of, I lifted up, let's listen to narratives and let's hear but what are the structures that make that possible? And you're actually suggesting a really specific structure that might help us hear witness to narratives that people have about their experiences of a sermon or of any part of worship in a really powerful way. And think about integrating that as part of worship. One of the practices that we've started doing at Columbia sometimes is, just 5 minutes of testimony of having people talk to one another during the service on a regular basis, just as a practice of witnessing and connecting with one another in a different kind of way than we had done prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we're still thinking about what are ways to, our live streamers are sometimes more reluctant to chat together on live stream. So what are ways that we're also really connecting our live streamers to one another in those moments of testimony? But thank you for that great suggestion idea. I really appreciate it. Any other questions on it?
Well, I think we ought to give a great show of thanks and how we would like to Dr. Spurrier for this excellent lecture and time of discussion. Thank you. I do believe we have a little time for reception and engaging with each other afterwards if you'd like to join us. Thank you those who joined us through our OWL and computers and those kinds of technologies. And we hope you'll join us again. We have plenty of events. Check out our upcoming events on our lpts.edu website. Thank you.